Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with Dr. Matthew Casey, who is an associate professor of history and director of the School of Humanities at the University of Southern Mississippi, where he is also affiliated with the Center for the Study of the Gulf South. Dr. Casey specializes in the history of empire, race, migration, political activism, and labor in early 20th century Cuba and Haiti. We will be discussing a Haitian Cuban Supercentenarian Emilio Duanes, the archives of migration and narratives of belonging in Cuba's digital landscape. So let's have a listen.
For Professor Casey for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, and to discuss your paper that you sent to me. I really enjoyed it, and it was really part of the narrative of when you are researching your family tree, that the oral history sometimes may not completely match with the actual documentation, but that's what we're going to be discussing today on this Supercentenarian Emilio Duanes, the archives of migration and narratives of belonging in Cuba's digital landscape. So before we start, can I just have you do just a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Matthew Casey. I'm an associate professor of history and also the director of the School of Humanities at the University of Southern Mississippi. I did publish a book 7 or 8 years ago called Empire's Guest Workers, and it is a full-length study of the experiences of Haitians who traveled to Cuba in the early 20th century. And this paper was a sequel to that, and I think that's what we're going to talk about today. So yeah, and thank you again for having me.
No, thank you, Professor Casey. And so we'll start, and then who was Emilio Duanes, and what makes his story significant in the history of Haitian migration to Cuba?
So Emilio Duanes is not somebody that I ever met. And what happened is that in the year 2021, there was a news story that was kind of making the rounds on social media. It was in some of the Cuban research sites, and it was about this individual who people said died at the age of 120 in Cuba. And they said that he had been born in Haiti and had traveled there as an immigrant. And as somebody who has, there's maybe 2 or 3 books on this topic, and one of them is one I had written. So I wanted to dig into the story because it fascinated me. And what was interesting to me is partly I was getting some details about his life story from the ample press coverage about his death, but also I guess they were commemorating his birthday the last 10 or 15 years of his life. And so it's partly about his life story, which I couldn't get that many details about, but it started raising all these questions to me, which is how do we do research about Caribbean migrants, especially those who traveled at a very young age? In his case, he was traveling with an adult woman, and that the age and gender dynamics change how people might appear in documents. And there's kind of this third issue, which is how is this migration discussed and remembered? And so this person who was 120, that people said, I have no way of confirming or denying that, became this magnet for all 3 of those questions. And so the article that I drafted and was published grapples with those 3 things.
Yeah, and those are those 3 major things that most genealogists or family historians do grapple with to be able to match the oral history to the documents that they may or may not be able to uncover, and whether or not they can get secondary sources, such as what you've looked at in terms of the newspapers. So going back to the migration journey, how how do we know? Like, I mean, I know that it was mentioned, but how do we know that how Duarte's was able to navigate his life in Haiti as a Haitian in Cuba?
In Cuba. So one of the challenges for me is
Mhm.
that almost every single news article about him, this is both after his death, but also in the kind of annual birthday commemorations about his life, is there were very few details shared about him, um, other than the year of his birth, the year of his arrival in Cuba. Um, but what was fascinating to me is the details that did exist. They all fit the kind of there was circumstantial evidence to back up his claims of old age, in the sense that he said that he, arrived with an adult aunt. That he then worked in the sugar industry as well as the coffee industry, that when his caretaker passed away at some point in his life, he was taken in by Cubans and moved around within Eastern Cuba for decades. And all of that is a perfect description of the things that we know that Haitian migrants experience. Many of them were recruited by sugar companies, but for a lot of different reasons. They also worked in Cuba's coffee industry. And in fact, the large influx of Haitians who had skills harvesting and cultivating coffee actually helped kind of increase Cuban coffee production in the early 20th century. And so all of the details that we do have about him in many ways check out. What we now, all that stuff was also true 10, 15, 20 years later. What we don't have, though, necessarily is evidence of it, documentary evidence. But we also know, as historians, as genealogists, as anybody who cares about the past, um, there are many things that happen for which we don't have documents. And I think, Wendy, you and I are going to talk about that later today.
Yeah, definitely. So, but before we do, I just wanted to get to what you said in terms of what to help us understand in terms of, I guess, the broader themes of his, migration,
Of course.
displacement, and of course, in his life in Cuba. Because again, what's the most important thing is the non-record type of thing.
Mhm. Yeah. And so if you'd like, I can talk just briefly about the Haitian migration to Cuba, kind of the broader waves. So before Duanes had ever, been the subject of a news article, if you read a book about the history of Cuba or the history of Haiti, you're going to see two very big, well-known migratory movements of people from the island that we now call Haiti to Cuba. The first one occurred during the Haitian Revolution. So at the end of the 18th century in the early 19th century. So like 1791 to 1804, something like 20,000 people left the colony of Saint-Domingue, which is what the French colonies named before Haiti, um, and went to Eastern Cuba. Now, in many ways, this was tragic for the enslaved people brought from Saint-Domingue to Cuba, because instead of getting the freedom that enslaved people received in Saint-Domingue starting in the 1790s, they would remain in slavery in Cuba. So Ada Ferrer is a well-known historian, and she's written one of a number of books that exist about the effects of the Haitian Revolution on Cuba. And she describes Cuba as a site of counter-revolution. So if the Haitian Revolution is this site of liberation, turning the world upside down, abolishing slavery, and kind of changing our conceptions of race and citizenship and everything, Cuba's doing the opposite. So if you look at Cuban sugar production, or if you look at the number of enslaved people in Cuba during and after the Haitian Revolution, the number just spikes up so high. And so, yes, there is a French-speaking component. There is a kind of Afro-Franco-Haitian culture in Eastern Cuba, but the circumstances for that 18th century arrival were of violence and actually reactionary, counter-revolutionary politics. So cultural influences, yes, but not with any joy attached. So, I mean, for lack of a better oversimplified way to describe it. fast forward a bit to the early 20th century, and this is really the migratory movement for that I write about. In the early 20th century, you have this moment where U.S. troops are going in and out of Cuba, and U.S. companies are investing heavily in the Cuban sugar industry. Similar processes are occurring in the Dominican Republic. This is when U.S. troops are in Nicaragua as well. And of course, Puerto Rico is under U.S. control by this time as well. So just to kind of set the scene. And from 1915 to 1934, U.S. troops are also in Haiti, occupying it militarily. A lot of really good scholarship has come out about that 19-year period in Haitian history. Something like 200,000 rural-born Haitians traveled to Cuba in that period. And there's a lot of difficulty in knowing, were these people just kind of trucked over by the sugar companies to provide free labor? Was this a form of resistance against U.S. troops, finding higher wages and maybe a better life elsewhere? My research kind of finds a combination of both. I mean, there were Haitians who went to Cuba well before U.S. troops arrived in Haiti. On the other hand, one of the things the U.S. occupation government did was kind of take this migratory movement, expand on it, regulate it, tax it, and make it sort of make it a more formalized recruitment process. And of course, migration is just one thing you do. So some rural-born Haitians went to Cuba, some went to the Dominican Republic, some joined the Haitian military, some went to cities, but going to Cuba is one thing that you could do. So it's that moment where something like 4% of Haiti's population goes to Cuba temporarily, some stay permanently, that I write about, trying to understand what it's like in this kind of doubly imperial space, right, with U.S. control in both islands. So, but it's known for being a more agricultural migratory movement, and so in eastern Cuba, if you look at a map, it's the eastern portion of Cuba too.
Yeah, I know when for my own research, there were some family members that did travel to Cuba themselves, and through some documentation, I was able to find that piece out because they then ended up eventually traveling to the United States. So that was the only reason how I was able to find that they had then family in Cuba before them migrating and leaving to the United States. Now, this then leads me to my next question: was there any attempt by Duanes to even have to reconnect with his family in Haiti? Or that is just, again, something that's just not really documented, or you could not be able to find?
So I did not find it. So if you'll permit, I think this will be useful for the audience, right? One of the challenges of this research in the first place is that over 90% of the migrants, the rural-born migrants of Haiti, were illiterate. And so you think about some of the great migration histories we have, and they're dealing with letters and diaries, and we just don't really have much of that from the Haitians who went to Cuba. And so the way that I was, and we also don't have the best port records either. So some of the records in Eastern Cuba were destroyed by accidental, I think, climate catastrophes was the impression that I got. And so we have numbers of arrivals every year, but we don't have their names, and we don't always have their nationalities, because sometimes they say this many people came and they're referring to the port they came from. And sometimes they just say non-specified Antillians, which could have been people from any number of Caribbean countries. And that is very relevant because there were many, many thousands of people from the British Caribbean arriving in Cuba as well. So you have these largely illiterate immigrants. And so, yes, there are newspaper accounts. And so I read Cuban newspapers. There's no text searching during this research, just turning the page and looking to see if I could see any kind of snippet of life, of anything that a Haitian migrant might do. But the most effective form of research, and I hope I'm answering your question and not going too far out of the way, but the most effective form of research was to look at rural court cases. That was one of them. In those court cases, anytime something happened, let's say there was a fight, a fire, a murder, or anything like that, the police would go and take all the witness testimony and they would say, what's your name? What's your age? Where were you born? And so on and so forth. So I would get some biographical information about bystanders. And they would say things like, well, I was doing my normal routine, which is I was going to just go do my laundry or get soap or whatever it was. I mean, that's an actual story that occurred. And then, this or that or other thing happened. And so when they were detailing the rupture of their day, they ended up telling me a lot about their day. So I ended up looking at hundreds of court cases just in these small towns in eastern Cuba. And these are all in libraries and archives. And I would start to get a sense of what was daily life like for a sugar worker. Who are they interacting with? That was a big one because I found out there were many more interactions between Haitians, Jamaicans, and Cubans than you would think. Like if you read the scholarship, you would assume the Haitians did this, the Jamaicans did this, the Cubans did this. But at the local level in the countryside, there's much more interaction and community building than we might think. Um, the other big source of information is citizenship petitions. In the 1930s in Cuba, for many, many reasons, you get immigrants from all different places in Cuba changing their citizenship to Cuban citizenship. And these are very large books. Imagine like a normal size textbook and putting four together. And so it's like you're turning a big page. If people are watching the video, they can see me motioning. And it's just, this person requests Cuban citizenship. They were born on this date. They arrived on this ship. And they give a lot of biographical information, sometimes even about a household. And I was able to figure out where migrants came from, what year they were arrived, how old they were, which port they came in, where they live now. And I was able to get a lot of good biographical information for a few hundred people, which is a lot, but it's nowhere near 200,000.
Yeah.
So then when I hear about, well, here's this guy, Emilio Duanes, and he lived to be 120, the first thing I did was I went to check to see if he was in any of the documents that I had, and he was not, which does not disprove his story. What it does is it tells you how limited these documents are. And so I don't know that he ever attempted to return back to Haiti. There were something like 40,000 people, 40,000 Haitian people forcefully deported from Cuba in the 1930s. And I actually have those lists. And just to double check, I made sure Duanes was not in that list, and he was not, which that would have been illogical, but part of the job of a scholar is you got to check, right? And so he was not on that list either. And I do see, the names and individuals and households too, because you would see 2 or 3 people with the same last name all being deported in these ship lists. And I didn't see Duanes there either. So can I tell you that many Haitians did maintain those long distance kind of transnational relationships? Yes. Was Duanes one of them? I have no evidence of it. And even the interviews, as narrow and limited as they were of him, they also did not describe that. No descriptions of return.
No, that's great, because what you're saying in terms of the how to even read some of those documents, because again, it does provide a wealth of information on there, but again, it's how do you glean what information is from there and kind of piece it together to make a kind of a narrative, a story about the person to kind of really flush them out. And it's unfortunate that there wasn't any other documentation of Emilio, but would you say, based on, because it's all oral, it's all pretty much mostly from what your research was from the newspapers and some of these court documentation, was there anything else that to provide any concreteness to this story?
About Duanes' story?
Yes.
Or no, and in some ways that's the frustrating part.
Yeah.
And so actually that question sort of transitions us into what occurred after the Cuban Revolution. because so just very quickly, you have really 5, 6 decades of U.S. dominance of Cuban politics and its economy. And in 1959, you get the success of a revolution, which very soon after its success, Fidel Castro becomes the leader, and then shortly after that, a couple years, and I know you know this, but I don't know
Yeah,
who's
yeah.
listening. So, and then Fidel Castro comes in and declares Cuba to be a socialist state, and the relationship with the United States deteriorates, and in fact, it was deteriorating even before that time. And so, one of the things that the socialist government did was it provided Social Security to all citizens. And this was the very early years of the revolution. And a few years after that, they made sure that those benefits also extended to everyone on the island, even if they did not have any kinds of documents. And this was important for sure for immigrants like Duanes or anybody else. Now, it's also, but that also would have extended to Cubans, right? I mean, Eastern Cuba was a place where, yes, there were efforts to make sure people had ID cards. I mean, Batista, before Castro, wanted all immigrants to sort of have some kinds of identification. But you have many undocumented people born in a lot of different places in Eastern Cuba. And so part of this new law from, I think, the early 60s, part of it was, yes, to extend citizenship. But if you think of the state's role as to govern and count and tax and do all those things, then, that's part of what a state would do in the 20th century is make sure they knew who people were and provide documentation. So it's partly for governance and partly for citizenship. And so I was trying to imagine a situation where somebody was born in Haiti or even in Cuba, and they are asked how old they are, and they would provide a number, and their best estimate, and it may be accurate or maybe not, and that's even without people trying to purposely change their age, and that's a whole separate question that we don't know. And just knowing how humans work, some probably did, some didn't, right? I mean, that's what they say. And so my guess is that Duanes's age was first established in a state archive and a state document, probably in the early 1960s.
Okay.
And that's most likely the first kind of paper trail we have of him. It's certainly, I have not found anything earlier, and I don't have access to those 1960s records. And so that is my speculation, but that is an educated guess based on a deep knowledge of the archives of Eastern Cuba. So it's most likely that he and certainly others around him, both Haitian, Jamaican, Cuban, Barbadian, right? That's probably when many people first got their ID cards. And their age became ratified. So whatever it was, it is now determined to be this other number.
It's just it's just quite amazing as to with these migration stories as to how they are in and out, so to speak, in like in documentation and without documentation, and how hard or how challenging it is to kind of piece together their story and to kind of flush them out, so to speak, because that makes it hard because you have nothing to validate their
Right.
their narrative. So, and I guess that's part of the whole challenge of reconstructing, Haitian migration in general, in
Yes.
Cuba, right?
So, and what's more is, I mean, a couple observations. One is the limits that scholars or descendants or genealogists have. That's something you have in common with the Cuban government of that period. So the things you can't see and know are the things that the government did not see and did not know either, which is really interesting to think about. So like what you're actually doing when you're looking at archives is you're seeing the things that the state saw,
Yes.
which is not everything.
Yeah.
And so that's one piece that I think is really interesting. And the other one is scholars have one advantage over genealogists, and
Mhm.
that is that a scholar of Haitian migration to Cuba, so that's what I am, right?
Mhm.
I want to find information from as many people who made the trip as possible, and I can start to piece together a story. You see where this is going,
Yes.
right? And so I was going, like when the libraries were closed, I would go into every bookstore, every not self-published book, but they have these
Mhm.
teeny tiny local book presses. And I actually found the memoirs of a woman um, whose father was Haitian and she was born in Cuba and wrote essentially a very like a 80-page autobiography. And it's wonderful. And so scholars are interested in any information they can get about any people who migrated. Family members are looking for that one individual. And so one of the things that I would suggest, actually, because I think many of the people who listen to this are people interested in their own family histories, is that some of the best ways to write any kind of biography, whether it's somebody that's an ancestor, a loved one, or whoever, is you have to do a lot of context work. So if your family oral history or the person that you're trying to understand worked on a sugar plantation. You know, hundreds of thousands of people did this. So if they worked on a sugar plantation, you might not know the name of the plantation and you might not know what their role was there. But you can tell a really powerful story that is powerful to you and historically accurate by saying, but this is what we do know about plantations. So as you're overturning those stones, build up a little bit of context, because that context is actually going to help you better understand things. And sometimes when I'm trying to write about an individual and I cannot find that specific person, that happens all the time, as you think, well, it's maybe this is what happened. And you tell that story to yourself, and you're learning a lot about history and other people's families with that maybe. And you have to be honest and say maybe. And then you say, or it could have been this, right? And then you go into other things and just saying those possibilities out loud actually gets you a lot closer to that person than you would. And it's certainly powerful for your audience. But as a scholar or, whatever your role is in uncovering the past, you always need to be really honest with yourself. This is verified, this is not, right? And things that aren't verified, they're just as important. Um, but you need to make that distinction when you're telling your story and you're thinking about things.
No,
Yeah, yeah.
no, definitely. I mean, what you said in regards to the fact of being able to look at other items, because of course, with a lot of family historians or genealogists, is mostly, concentrating on birth, death, and marriage records. That is not always
Right.
going to be the case, and it's not always going to be available. So then you have to be open to look at other documentation. Like you've mentioned, going to the court, local court records to be able to get items, of course, the citizenship, and of course, just being able to look at if there are any shipping records for documentation to that. But it's again opening up the scope of how you're going to look at it and be very, very broad with it.
Hmm.
And using, of course, oral stories, because we have to start with that first and foremost
Absolutely.
before we can start. And I guess in this case, for just in general for the Haitian migration, I guess this fills in, I guess, the archival gaps in this case. Would you say that's correct?
Absolutely. And let me give you two examples that I think that will resonate in our conversation. One is that archival gaps exist even when they don't. And what I mean is, especially in the Caribbean, which is a multilingual zone where even state officials they do not all have the same literacy rates as a well-educated person today. And so names are going to be misspelled. If there is a name, let's say there is a Haitian name that is heard or misheard in Cuba, it's going to be written in a totally different way. And so Kind of a couple examples that I've seen in the Cuban archives is the name Francois, which in the kind of proper French spelling would be Franc with that little cedille at the bottom, the little tail, OIS, Francois. In Cuban archives, it's often spelled as Fransua, which makes perfect sense. But if you are doing text searches, you are not going to see the Francois you want to see if you're not trying different alternatives. Um, Something even more complicated is, so there was a ship that just kind of moved around in the Caribbean, and it had an English name, the Wanderer. So Wanderer, Wanderer. And it took me a little while to realize that some people were spelling that as Juan Dore. So Juan, like the name Juan, and then Dore, which is actually a totally appropriate way. If you hear wanderer, especially whoever's telling it to you is either going to have a Haitian or a Cuban accent. If they're saying wanderer and saying it differently, of course it's going to be Juan Dore. And I've even seen Cuban records where it says the name of this British Caribbean person is what you name. And that's what it's his photograph, and it says what you name, meaning that this person was either and this was a prison record, so they could have been taunting their jailers back, or they could have been asking, what is this person asking me? And then somebody's translating, they're echoing it back, and this jailer who doesn't really care, they're not here for descendants and historians, they're just there to do their job, writes what you name. And so we'll never fully know that, but that just gives you little glimpses into how complicated these kinds of archival documents are. Um, and so, in terms of the oral history, these are really fascinating too, because one of the things I noticed in Cuba is that local scholars, especially those who had published in the 60s and 70s, um, so they actually had much more access to living migrants, right? Whereas I first got there in 2007, and so really I interacted with some descendants, but original migrants I never met. And obviously Duanes I didn't even know about until I learned of his passing. Um, but so these Cuban scholars writing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, really the 70s and 80s, are telling stories about Haitians participating in the Communist Party. And there's a couple ways to interpret that. One is, yeah, they participated, right? I mean, that's always one possibility when you're reading a text. Or you could think, well, this is a Cuban historian writing in a socialist government where obviously if you're going to try to write something praiseworthy, you're going to go back and identify participation in the communist government, in the Communist Party. And so I thought, okay, that's a possibility. So one possibility is they were there. Another possibility is they were maybe there and these people are over exaggerating it for the sake of their own kind of agenda. But then I was a little bit confused because I'm like, I don't really have that many archival sources about Haitians engaging in communism. So I'm like, what explains this disconnect? And I found a court case where a Haitian was actually carrying radical leaflets and the police stopped him and he essentially played dumb and just said, I don't know, I was just given these by these other people. And then the police arrested the other people and let the Haitian go. And so what it tells me is even the archival documents have these flaws because we will never know whether that person carrying the leaflets was involved in those radical politics. But if the people writing down the sources, which are often police officers and low-level bureaucrats, if they're writing down the sources and they don't think somebody's participating in this or that, they're not going to write it down. And so I use that disconnect between the Cuban scholars because it was too oversimplified to just be like they're biased, they want to find communists. But I was a little uncomfortable, and then I realized, of course, so I can explain why we don't see things in the archives, which we might think we could, And then we put those alongside oral histories, and then you start to get a better picture that it's not that these Cuban scholars are biased. I mean, we all have our own perspectives,
Mhm.
um, but they're getting something from conversations that bureaucrats writing the documents, who are cops a lot of times, are not getting. And that actually makes more sense than anything in my mind. So yeah, so you always have to think, how was this archival document born, so to speak? And that's a big piece of it too, you know?
It definitely is because just to know where that source came from and how it came
Yeah.
about is the other thing because it again, yes, it does provide more of, I guess, as I call it, it just fleshes people out, so to speak. But
Hmm.
where and why, like, you know, like you have to question it and you just
Hmm.
can't just take it as like it's a God source, so to speak.
Right. Oh
So
yeah, absolutely.
you know, and then going on to just back to Emilio. Um,
Hmm.
with Cuba and of course the digital landscape, like how
Oh
did
yeah.
preserving and sharing stories like Emilio, how did that help that, if at all?
Um, for me, it was another dimension on things, right? And so there's a couple different ways to respond to this.
Mhm.
But one thing I want to be clear, so that I'll say this at the beginning, and I hope to kind of explain it and come back to it at the end. The digital landscape, if you will, right? It's its own kind of archive, has just as many gaps as the traditional paper one. And we've got to remember that. And I don't mean the whole like there's not trustworthy things on the internet. I mean, like we all know that, right? But I mean, even the things that we see that do seem more or less trustworthy, there's still things that they're not saying. There's a distance between the archive and real life, and there's
Mhm.
also a distance between the kind of digital archive and real life. And Duanes really helped show that. And so one of the things that I was doing is, okay, I'm a scholar of this migratory movement. I've written a book on it. I have the names of all these people. And then here's a very interesting person with a very interesting life. And so I was doing Google searches and I was getting kind of the same stories over and over again. And those were, I mean, essentially when he died, everybody was just translating the same news article, no problem. But then I found kind of annual birthday articles that Cuban journalists were writing, and I found that those were really repetitive too.
Mm.
And that was interesting to me because even when different journalists wrote it, they said kind of the same things over and over again. And so it seemed that if this person lived to be 120 years old, and he clearly lived to be very old. So whether or not he's 120, I don't care. Like even if he was only 80 or 90 or 100, that's still a long life, right? And yet of of that century of life, we only have six stories. And they're not even stories, they're characteristics. And that to me was frustrating. Um, and there were a couple things at play. One was that the Cuban journalists were kind of trying to make this Haitian into a Cuban. So if you read the article, I spend some time where a Cuban audience, in order to make this guy interesting, is going to render him Cuban. So they said, oh, he actually knew Fidel and Raul when he grew up because he lived on the same farm that their parents owned and interacted with them. And so that was a common story. They said he arrived near the place where Jose Marti, who is this like super important Cuban independence leader who died in the 1890s. They said he was near Marti's uh, place of final resting, and so they're just kind of tying him to all of these nationalist moments in Cuban history. So as you read his life, there's almost like this Forrest Gump, if you know that movie, where they're like plugging him into these big moments in Cuban history. And so to get the audience to care about him, first of all, they were just getting rid of any details and just focusing on a few things. And those few things were like hyper Cuban things. And so one of the claims I make in this paper is that in order to be interesting for his Cuban audience, he had to be rendered Cuban. But the only reason we have the story in the first place is because we don't have enough documents to prove it or disprove it. And the main reason for that is that he was not born in Cuba, that he was born in Haiti. So he had to be Haitian for the story to exist in some ways. But he had to be Cuban in order for people to write about it. So that's one thing, and I talk about that in the article. But I also noticed that it's the same story over and over and over again in all these Cuban websites. And I think, the repetition was curious to me. Um, and the Cuban internet is big enough to look at, right? But it's also small enough where you can actually treat the Cuban digital sphere, at least at the time I was writing. I mean, that probably changes daily, but you can kind of glance at you actually can read every news story about this guy in a way that's not possible for most other events in most other countries, right? And so, like, you can do some of the old school archival, you get a whole bunch of text, but one human being can read that text. And you can do that, you could at the time with the Cuban internet in a way that you couldn't do with any other. And so what I noticed is that all of these archival repetitions were, he had to be Haitian, but then he had to be rendered Cuban. And we'll get to some of the problematic aspects of the Cuban rendering. I'm guessing we'll get to that in a moment. But I did find one or two other news stories on the internet, like from Cuban news source sites about Duanes doing other things that had nothing to do with Cuban nationalism. Or I'll just explain and then you can decide, right? But essentially, starting in the 1970s, but blowing up in the 1990s, you have all of these descendant communities emerging. So like second and third generation Haitians in Cuba are actually kind of creating folkloric groups either for themselves in the community or for tourists or both, right? And so you'll see like folkloric dances, you know, real but also kind of public performances of voodoo spiritual ceremonies and serving the spirits and things like that. And also the commemoration of moments that are deeply important to Haitians in Cuba. So like things like this is a horrible thing, but there was a massacre that occurred in Cuba in 1933, and Haitians were the predominant victims of that. So there's a monument in the city of Cortaderas, and there's a Spanish language book about this. And so Duanes actually went to one of these commemorations. And even though that's perfectly fine in Cuban socialism, I mean, that is a kind of recognizing the sins of the pre-socialist Cuban past. Like there is nothing scandalous or, the government will have no problem about that. They helped build that monument. But him going to that monument that time, which was covered in the news, doesn't make it in all these repetitive stories. And the reason is because it doesn't fit the way humans like to tell stories. Humans like a beginning, middle, end, and a certain level of cleanliness. And if you have a guy who had to be Haitian for the story to exist and had to be Cuban for the story to be interesting, him sitting down looking at this kind of monument doesn't really quite fit. And so for me, it's like, oh, okay, well, here's like different ways to think about hyphenated Cuban nationalism in the present. Cool. Okay. And as a scholar, you normally say, well, here's one perspective and here's the other. But since we're looking at the digital world, then I start noticing, well, what does it mean if this one perspective is one news website 10 years before this person passed away, and this other is 30 news websites. Again, these are finite numbers at the moment. That tells me something about what Cuban media consumers are seeing. Now, that commemoration that he went to, they do that every year. Mm-hmm. And you cannot tell me that he did not go to earlier festivals. Mm-hmm. There's no way he didn't. And if he didn't, other people did. But my point is, we don't see it in the Cuban kind of digital treatment. And it's not because of censorship, it's because of those same kind of odd market forces, likes, clicks, and shares that work on any kind of digital landscape. And so for me, that was the really interesting thing. And Duanes is this perfect way to look at kind of the limits of paper archives. What is the gap between what we live, feel, and who we consider ourselves to be, and how the government depicts that for posterity to try to figure out later, number one, but then the same in the digital landscape, right?
No, for sure. And not only that, it goes back to what you're saying. You cannot necessarily prove or disprove of a particular story.
Mhm.
And this is, again, with Emilio Duantes, this is what I guess what his story does offer. And would you be able to speak to, I guess, the resilience and, of course, the complex nature of just identity in the Caribbean in general?
Yes. Um, so so Caribbean identities, and I know the audience knows this in a way that's much deeper than I ever will, right? And so I recognize that. Um, Caribbean identities do not necessarily they're not limited to national or even linguistic borders, right? And so the Caribbean has been marked by movement. Even before any Europeans arrived, indigenous people moved among different islands, and many people speak multiple languages, whether it's French and Haitian Creole, or French and Spanish, or English, or some kind of combination of any of those. But archives are bound by states and empires, right? And that is a challenge. And so if you think about what it means to be a scholar, if you're or a genealogist, you're trying to do this research, and it's true work for everybody, right? Whether it's as a profession or as something for you and your family, you have to pick the state archive that you're going to go to, and so migrants are always difficult, because they're going to appear probably in multiple archives, possibly in multiple languages, and those are going to be in different cities or countries. And so scholars, when they write about the Caribbean, often they're writing about the British Caribbean or the Spanish Caribbean. And you know what? That makes sense, because if they didn't do that, we would have no books at all, right? And so, like, there is something that at some point we've got to organize our thinking in a way and do that writing. And archives are certainly bound by the state, whether that's the nation state or the empire, right? And yet, if people are moving, it's really hard to find people on the go, right? And it's also hard to govern them, which is why governments always get frustrated with people on the move, right? Which is also why, if you write about migrants, you learn a lot about the unwritten rules of political science too, because they are a challenge to authorities. And so um, yeah, and so you have people crossing linguistic boundaries, and scholars doing so at a much slower rate.
Mhm.
And so kind of bilingual communities, hyphenated identities, any kind of creolized ways that people identify are just going to be really hard to capture. Um, and in fact, there has been some really good anthropological work on descendant communities now. So, I mean, two names that come to mind are Greta Vidal and Yannick Hume, who both published numerous articles on Caribbean descendants in Cuba, for example. Um, and there are many others too. Shoot, I'm embarrassed. I'm blanking on a name. I'll say the name in a moment. Well, I want to give a shout out to these people who've done great work. But through anthropological methods, they've actually learned a lot, because they're able to check. They're able to do something that gets closer to these oral histories, but they're also looking at how people kind of perform identity, right? It's not just people saying this is who I am, but there's also all these things about the foods you eat have history embedded
Yeah.
within them. And sometimes it takes an outsider, whether that is a child or grandchild or a scholar, to say, let's talk a little bit more about this and let's like say it out loud and kind of figure out what's going on. Um, and so anthropological work has been really fascinating about that and like getting those oral histories, and especially not just identities. There are the identities that people have, as well as how those are kind of performed or projected for the state or for tourists, which is a different thing. Um, and you can do both, and there can be some difference in those things without there being any hypocrisy. That's just, and everybody does this, right? I mean, and so if you are a descendant community performing for a group of tourists who just came off of a cruise ship, it's going to be a little bit different than a kind of much more private religious ceremony, or just kind of dance or musical event that you're doing when it's just your family or your community. Um, but yeah, the kind of super complex identities in the Caribbean are just so fascinating. And I guess I could talk about some of the limits to those positive aspects. And what I'm referring to is Cuban racism in the present, kind of anti-Blackness. I could talk about that now, or we could get to that in a little bit, but that was something else that kind of reared itself when I was doing research on Duanes too. And so should we
Yeah,
go there?
let's talk about that.
Okay. So the quick version, the quick kind of historical version is that in and people familiar with Cuban history and Cuban scholarship will know this story, but in the 19th century in Cuba, there is a claim that to be Cuban was to surpass blackness or whiteness or race altogether. And instead, we are all just Cuban. And that changed over the years, but one of the results is that it became very difficult to speak out against racism in Cuba. Now, people still found very creative ways, both individuals and activist groups found creative ways to kind of highlight moments of racism that continued to persist, even though they're in denial about it. But that was something in the 19th century. It existed in the decades when the US sort of dominated Cuba, and it has remained to this day in the kind of socialist and later time period, right? And so, and essentially, whatever index you choose, you are going to see disparities based on race in Cuba and active and overt forms of racism there. And so that is always what's happening alongside these kind of discourses of it doesn't really exist here. And so there's entire libraries about the interplay between those two things.
No,
So
thank you so much, Professor Casey, for sharing that, because that is definitely true. You do see that, and that definitely does come through in whether not just only in Cuba, but throughout the Caribbean as well.
absolutely, yes. And so it's that interplay between the kind of nationalism claiming equality and the sort of very real biases and inequalities and discrimination based on race, based on color, that that again, I mean, tons of work has been written about how this functions in the Caribbean. So for Duanes, it was interesting because journalists kind of bent over backwards to make him Cuban, right? Because again, that's what makes the story interesting. Oh, we have to like find him in the same geographic place as Jose Marti, even though Marti died before Duanes was born, um, and all of these other things. And yet there was still this kind of way of talking about Duanes that sort of implied that he's not quite Cuban. Right. And so, one of them, I'm trying to think now, I wish I had the essay in front of me. But sometimes people would say like, yeah, he has a very Cuban, he has a very Cuban way of being, and despite being Haitian, there was always like a despite. There's like the kind of despite the almost, Sometimes they use language that was a little bit patronizing. So
Mhm.
like they talked about him like being very respectful, which in the context that I read that particular one, it was almost like in the equivalent in the United States when somebody says that that a person of color is articulate, where there's like so much you know, kind of paternalism and like subtle racism in that comment that it actually is very revealing of not of something else going on, right? And so you see glimpses of people describing Duanes like that. And the respectability politics in Cuba are still there, right? I mean, there's this sense that like migrants in some ways have to prove themselves to be good socialists and good hard workers in a way that's kind of assumed for other groups and not there, even though these are, not in the case of Duanes, who was born in Haiti, but, these descendant communities are still they're facing the racism that all Cubans of African descent receive, but then there's extra kind of comments and jabs about Haitianness and probably even well, no, not probably, certainly that Jamaicans experience as well, and other, British Caribbean descendants there. And so for me, Duanes shows you, um, kind of allows you to just look at these ways that Cuban identity is described. Yes, a hyphenated identity is possible. Yes, there's this kind of claim of assimilation, but there's always this asterisk behind it. It's always like a not quite. And it's in the way he's described in a way that almost implies that whatever acceptance Duanes has, maybe other people in the community don't, right? Which is another way of saying like it's not automatic for people. If you have like some random neighbor saying, "Oh yeah, I deem him Cuban," which is, in some ways is what was happening. Um, it implies that that person gets to decide and that some people aren't, which is not how the national discourse claims things work. So I was able to kind of use his story to interact with some of that scholarship about contemporary Cuba.
No, and it just goes to the complexity of his story, but it's very similar to in genealogy when you're researching to again to match the oral story to
Hmm.
and just to be able to get evidence, I guess you can say, to
Hmm.
kind of back it up. And then, as we close, Professor Casey, what would you say is important to, like, why is it important for us to remember and share stories of Haitian migrants like Emilio Duanes for today?
Um, a lot of reasons, a whole lot of reasons. One of them is the easiest for me to say first, and for anyone in the United States right now, the most important, and that is that xenophobia and anti-immigrant racism is surprisingly repetitive. And what I mean is the things that people say about immigrants of all nationalities seem to be the same. And I hope that as you read about migrants' experiences, but also the racism that migrants face in many countries, but not always, right? And so this is something that can be overcome. But as you read about that and you realize how repetitive it is, you start to think, okay, maybe that repetition means that it's false. Like if that supposedly applies here, but also here and also here and also here, maybe humans have a certain way of articulating their anti-immigrant beliefs. And so when you read about xenophobia in the past, you can find echoes in the present and hopefully distance yourself from both. And I think that's really powerful,
Yeah.
like super powerful, in fact. And so that's one thing. I mean, another thing is we are still trying to figure out so many aspects of Caribbean history. And I am of the opinion that whatever country you're looking at, I'm always super interested in kind of daily life and ordinary people. And I think I mentioned earlier that looking at migrant stories is a form of political science. Because if you want to know how governments actually function, you can look at their laws and constitutions, or you can look at how they were experienced by people. And then you think, okay, if people, and this is the least personal way to look at it. But so even if you don't care about migrants at all, which I think many people in your audience do, I certainly do, I imagine you do as well. But even if you don't care about them at all, as a way to understand how politics and history work, migrants are the best windows into that than anybody. State institutions are built around them, they follow them, government offices change what they do in response to the way migrants work. And so, especially in a place like the Caribbean, whether you have a post-colonial national government or a place like Haiti that's kind of ruled by the US, but technically independent, but not really. Then you have a place like Cuba, which, has US troops coming and going. It's not like there's some formalized political science. And even people in charge didn't know what they were always doing. And if you want to actually understand how that works, look at who experienced it. And so for me, migrants have, I mean, we care about people. We care about understanding the complexity of the Caribbean. We care about people in the present. And this is a time where looking at the past really helps. But even if you don't care about all that stuff, and if you're one of those people, I doubt you've made it this far in the podcast, but even if you don't care about all of that stuff, then migrants are the perfect test cases for political science and history in action, right? And that's why they're challenging to write about. It's very difficult if it's your family history, but it's also really rewarding, you know? And so, yeah, so I think that's probably my response to that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, because it is, I mean, you do follow, like, I mean, for myself, I know I followed their story, followed where they went, where they traveled, and it's quite fascinating. And to know how, as an example, my grandfather went to the United States and he was able to go there for 6 months and just decide to say, how long, because the immigration officer asked, well, how long you're staying? I'm going to stay for 6 months. And I'm thinking, wow, 6 months, no visa, no, that was before that time,
Okay.
but fascinating, right? To be able to
Yes.
know that people could be able to travel just on saying how long that they were going to stay for a
Hmm.
particular time, and to come into the country and work, which I thought was even more so surprising to see that, and then to go back to Jamaica. So what you wrote about is a common theme, and it's common to all families. It's just that this particular person was for someone that's lived over 100 years, and
Yeah,
again, it just shows one of the challenges of being able to really, I guess, prove or disprove that particular narrative. So, thank you.
absolutely. Yes. Thank you.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.